In the late 1980s, rock seemed to be everywhere. Stadiums filled with audiences, tours stretching across continents, and bands with long hair, electric guitars, and loud sound dominating the charts. But even in an era full of stars like that, only a few voices could truly define an entire generation. One of them was the voice of Axl Rose. That voice was almost impossible to mistake. High, fierce, sometimes nearly wild, yet capable of shifting into soft, deeply emotional moments within a single line. When standing on stage with Guns N' Roses, Axl Rose was not just a singer. He was like an unpredictable source of energy, capable of turning every performance into an experience that felt both chaotic and magnetic. When the album Appetite for Destruction appeared, very few people could predict how it would change rock. But soon, each song began to spread. The aggressive guitar riffs, the raw lyrics about street life in Los Angeles, and above all, the voice of Axl Rose. Rebellious, fragile, and almost as if it were trying to escape something deep inside. Within just a few years, Guns N' Roses had become the biggest rock band in the world. Stadiums full of fans, massive tours, songs like Welcome to the Jungle, Paradise City, and Sweet Child O' Mine became the sound of an entire era, and at the center of it all was always Axl Rose. But his story is not only a story about fame, because right after reaching global heights, Axl Rose almost disappeared from the spotlight for many years. Not because the audience turned away, not because his music was no longer loved, but because behind the glare of rock stardom was a chain of pressures, conflicts, and upheavals that pushed his path in a very different direction. What really happened to Axl Rose? Why did one of the most iconic voices in rock withdraw from the spotlight just after reaching the peak? To understand that, we must go back to where it all began. A small town in Indiana, where a boy named William Bruce Rose Jr. grew up without ever knowing that his voice would one day become part of rock history. The story of Axl Rose does not begin in Los Angeles. It begins in a small town in the American Midwest, Lafayette, Indiana. He was born in 1962 with the birth name William Bruce Rose Jr. But from the very early years of his life, the life of this boy was far from simple. Axl's family went through many upheavals, complicated relationships, tensions within the family, and a highly disciplined environment shaped a childhood filled with conflict. For many years, he grew up in a very strict religious setting. Church, prayer meetings, and rigid moral rules became a constant part of everyday life. But for Axl, that very place unexpectedly became where he first began to discover music. He joined the church choir when he was very young. There, he learned how to control his voice, from emotional high notes to powerful, sustained passages. People around him quickly realized that this boy had an unusual voice, not only powerful, but also possessing a rare vocal range. Music gradually became an escape. In an environment where Axl often felt restrained, singing allowed him to release emotions he could not express in words. The anger, the frustration, and the desire to escape his current life. All of it gradually found its way through music. By the early 1980s, Axl knew that if he wanted to become a musician, he had to leave Indiana. So he left Indiana and moved to Los Angeles, a city that was becoming the center of a new rock movement. There, Axl entered the world of Sunset Strip, a stretch of street known for its rock clubs, where dozens of young bands performed every night hoping to be discovered. It was an environment completely different from Indiana. Louder, more chaotic, and intensely competitive. But it was there, among the neon lights of small clubs and cramped stages, that Axl Rose began to find his path. And it was also in Los Angeles that he would soon meet the musicians who would join him in creating a band that the whole world would later know by the name Guns N' Roses. When Axl Rose arrived in Los Angeles in the early 1980s, he stepped into a world filled with competition. The Sunset Strip at that time was the center of the American rock scene. Every night, dozens of young bands performed in small clubs, all hoping to become the next name to be discovered. Most of the bands then were pursuing glam metal, glamorous music with polished guitars, big hair, and colorful stage images. But Axl Rose was drawn to something rougher and more authentic. It was in Los Angeles that he began meeting the musicians who would completely change his path. One of them was Slash, a guitarist with a strong blues rock style and deeply emotional solos. Alongside Slash was Duff McKagan, a bassist from Seattle with clear punk influences. They were also joined by Izzy Stradlin, Axl's old friend from Indiana, and drummer Steven Adler. In 1985, these 5 musicians formed Guns N' Roses. From the very beginning, their music was different from the rest of the Sunset Strip scene. While many glam metal bands focused on image and glamour, Guns N' Roses delivered a sound that was rougher, more dangerous, and somewhat unpredictable. Their music blended many different influences: the rebellion of punk, the emotion of blues rock, and the weight of classic hard rock. The first songs the band played in small clubs carried an energy that was almost chaotic, yet that was exactly what made them stand out. Audiences began to notice. In a scene full of bands that looked alike, Guns N' Roses felt more real, more intense, and somewhat more dangerous. Their performances at clubs along the Sunset Strip quickly became well known. Within a short time, Guns N' Roses had become one of the most talked about bands in Los Angeles. But none of them could imagine that only a few years later, this band would release a debut album, an album that would not only change their lives, but also change the sound of rock for many years to come. In 1987, Guns N' Roses released their debut album, Appetite for Destruction. Today, that album is considered one of the most important rock albums ever recorded. But at the time of its release, things did not happen as quickly as many people might imagine. In its first months, Appetite for Destruction sold rather slowly. Radio stations were not quite sure what to do with a band whose sound was far rougher than the glam metal dominating the market. MTV was also cautious about the band's somewhat dangerous and rebellious image. But then things began to change. One song from the album gradually started to attract attention: Sweet Child O' Mine. At first, it was simply a song built around an improvised guitar riff by Slash. But when the track began to receive airplay on radio and MTV, it quickly became a major hit. Audiences started seeking out the album, and when they listened to the entire Appetite for Destruction, they realized that this was not just an ordinary rock album. It was a statement. Songs like Welcome to the Jungle, Paradise City, and Sweet Child O' Mine brought an energy that rock had not seen in many years. The music of Guns N' Roses was both aggressive and authentic, carrying the influence of classic blues while also holding the rebellious spirit of punk. The album began climbing the charts. Then it climbed even higher. Eventually, Appetite for Destruction sold more than 30 million copies worldwide and became the best-selling debut album in the history of rock. Within just a few years, Guns N' Roses went from a band playing small clubs in Los Angeles to the biggest rock band on the planet. And at the center of it all was the voice of Axl Rose. His voice could move from an angry roar to nearly fragile high notes within the same song. It carried both the rebellious feeling of street rock and an emotional depth rarely heard in hard rock at that time. That voice became an inseparable part of the sound of Guns N' Roses, and by the end of the 1980s, it could be heard everywhere. From radio and MTV to packed stadiums all around the world, by the early 1990s, Guns N' Roses was no longer just a rising band. They had become a global phenomenon. Their debut album had brought them to the top, but the band had no intention of stopping there. In 1991, Guns N' Roses made a move rarely seen in the history of rock. They released 2 albums at the same time, Use Your Illusion 1 and Use Your Illusion 2. These 2 albums showed a band expanding its music far beyond simple hard rock. If Appetite for Destruction carried the rough street sound of Los Angeles, then Use Your Illusion was far more ambitious, with piano ballads, orchestral arrangements, and longer, more complex song structures. One of the clearest examples was the song November Rain. With piano, extended guitar solos, and a cinematic-style music video, the song showed that Guns N' Roses could move beyond the boundaries of traditional hard rock. Alongside it were songs such as Don't Cry and Civil War, each carrying a different tone, from emotional ballads to songs with stronger social themes. The success of the 2 albums quickly brought the band into a new phase of their career. They launched the Use Your Illusion tour, a tour that stretched across continents and years, becoming one of the largest tours of that era. Massive stadiums, complex stage productions, and hundreds of thousands of fans each night turned Guns N' Roses into one of the most influential rock bands in the world. At the center of it all was still Axl Rose. But as the band's fame grew, the pressure began to grow with it. Long tours, personal differences, and creative tensions gradually appeared within the band. Certain conflicts that had already existed before began to become harder to control as Guns N' Roses became one of the biggest names in rock. And while the world was watching the band at the peak of its fame, the cracks inside Guns N' Roses were beginning to appear. When Guns N' Roses reached the peak of its fame in the early 1990s, from the outside, everything seemed perfect. Albums selling millions of copies, massive tours, and a band considered a symbol of hard rock for that era. But behind that spotlight, the internal atmosphere of the band was becoming increasingly tense. Personal conflicts appeared more frequently. The members had different views about the music, about the direction of the band, and even about how Guns N' Roses should be managed. At the same time, the extreme rock and roll lifestyle of that period, with long parties, the pressure of touring, and personal struggles, made everything harder to control. The first cracks appeared quite early. In 1990, drummer Steven Adler left the band after serious problems related to drugs. His departure was the first sign that the classic lineup of Guns N' Roses was beginning to change. Not long after that, guitarist Izzy Stradlin also left the band in 1991. Izzy was often seen as one of the people who helped maintain balance within the group, and his departure made the internal structure of the band more fragile. The following years brought even more changes. The relationship between Axl Rose and guitarist Slash gradually became strained. Differences in musical vision and the way the band should be managed pushed the two further apart. Eventually, Slash left Guns N' Roses in the mid-1990s. Soon after, bassist Duff McKagan also left the band. Within only a few years, the classic lineup that had created Appetite for Destruction had almost completely fallen apart. By the end of the 1990s, Axl Rose was the only remaining member from the original formation. Guns N' Roses still existed, but it was no longer the five-member band it had once been. Instead, it gradually became a project centered around Axl, with new musicians joining and leaving throughout the years. For many fans, this was a confusing period. The band that had once defined an era of rock now seemed to almost disappear from the spotlight. And while the world still remembered Guns N' Roses as a symbol of the late 1980s and early 1990s, Axl Rose began to enter a long period of silence. After the classic lineup of Guns N' Roses fell apart in the mid and late 1990s, the future of the band became very difficult to predict. For many fans, it seemed that Guns N' Roses had already closed the most important chapter of its story. But for Axl Rose, the story was not over. In the years that followed, Axl began working on a new album titled Chinese Democracy. The original idea was to create a new musical direction for Guns N' Roses, an ambitious, complex album that would be different from anything the band had done before. But the production process quickly became far longer than expected. Musicians were constantly changing. Different guitarists, bassists, and producers joined the project and then left over the course of many years. Each change forced parts of the album to be revised, re-recorded, or restructured. At the same time, the production costs of the album continued to rise. According to many sources in the music industry, Chinese Democracy became one of the most expensive albums ever produced. Millions of dollars were invested in the recording, mixing, and editing process that stretched across many years. But perhaps the heaviest burden was not the cost, it was the expectation. After the enormous success of Appetite for Destruction and the era of Use Your Illusion 1 and Use Your Illusion 2, any next album from Guns N' Roses had to face tremendous pressure from the public and the media. With each year that passed without the album appearing, the curiosity and expectations of audiences only grew larger. Throughout that entire period, Axl Rose almost disappeared from the media. Very few interviews, very few public appearances, and almost no clear explanation about how the album was progressing. That silence made Axl's image almost legendary. Rumors spread everywhere about abandoned recordings, different versions of the album, and whether Chinese Democracy would ever be released at all. Finally, after more than a decade of waiting, Chinese Democracy was released in 2008. The reaction from the public and critics was quite mixed. Some praised the ambition and complexity of the album. Others felt that it was too far removed from the sound of Guns N' Roses that they had once known. But regardless of the divided opinions, Chinese Democracy still carried a special meaning. Because for many years before it appeared, the album had already become one of the most anticipated albums in the history of rock. And during that long stretch of time, Axl Rose lived almost entirely outside the spotlight, as if one of the greatest voices in rock had chosen to exist in silence. For many years, one idea seemed impossible to rock fans: the classic lineup of Guns N' Roses would never reunite. The conflicts between the members during the 1990s had become too deep, especially the long-standing tension between Axl Rose and guitarist Slash. For many years, the two barely spoke to each other, and any rumor about a reunion was quickly dismissed. So when 2016 arrived, very few people truly believed that anything could change. But then an unexpected announcement appeared. Axl Rose would reunite with Slash and bassist Duff McKagan to perform together for the first time in more than 2 decades. For fans, it was almost an unimaginable moment. 3 central members of Guns N' Roses standing together on stage once again. Not in a short performance or a special event, but in a global tour titled the Not in This Lifetime Tour. From the very first shows, the audience's reaction revealed just how long the wait had been. Stadiums quickly sold out. Fans from different generations, from those who had listened to Appetite for Destruction in the late 1980s to younger listeners, all wanted to witness the band's return. The tour quickly became a global phenomenon. The Not in This Lifetime tour eventually grossed hundreds of millions of dollars and became one of the highest-grossing tours in the history of rock. But more important than the revenue numbers was what the tour represented. After years of silence, after conflicts that once seemed impossible to repair, and after a long period of almost disappearing from the spotlight, Axl Rose had returned to the stage. And this time, he was not standing there alone. In the history of rock, some singers are remembered for their hit songs. Others are remembered for legendary performances. But a very small number of artists are remembered because their voice became the sound of an entire era. Axl Rose is one of them. Throughout his career with Guns N' Roses, the band has sold more than 100 million albums worldwide, becoming one of the best-selling rock bands in history. The album Appetite for Destruction alone has sold more than 30 million copies, and it still holds the record as the best-selling debut album in the history of rock. Songs like Sweet Child of Mine, Welcome to the Jungle, and November Rain did not simply become hits. They became part of global rock culture. The music video for November Rain was one of the first rock videos to surpass 1 billion views on YouTube, many decades after the song was originally released. And the reunion tour, Not in This Lifetime tour, generated more than $580 million in revenue, becoming one of the highest-grossing tours in the history of music. But those numbers tell only part of the story. What makes Axl Rose different is not only success. It is the way his voice carries a type of emotion that very few rock singers can reach. Anger, vulnerability, and the rebellious spirit of an entire generation. His influence can be seen across many later styles of music, from hard rock and alternative rock to the vocal styles of many singers from later generations. But the story of Axl Rose also raises an interesting question. After reaching the peak of fame, when stadiums are filled with audiences, when your songs have become part of music history, what happens when an artist no longer wants to live under the spotlight in the same way? For many years, the silence of Axl Rose made many people believe that he had disappeared from the world of rock. But perhaps the real story is more complicated than that. Sometimes, silence is not disappearance. Sometimes it is simply another way to exist. The story of Axl Rose is not the story of a rock star following a familiar path. He has lived through almost every extreme of fame. From a young man leaving Lafayette, Indiana with a dream of music, to standing before hundreds of thousands of fans with Guns N' Roses. From an album that changed rock like Appetite for Destruction, to years of silence that very few people truly understood. For many years, many people believed that Axl Rose had disappeared from the world of rock. But the truth may be simpler than that. He did not disappear. He simply chose to step away from the spotlight for a while. And when he returned to the stage with Slash and Duff McKagan, tens of thousands of fans each night during the Not in This Lifetime tour proved something very clear. Some voices do not belong to just one era. They become part of history. And the voice of Axl Rose is certainly one of them. If you enjoy real stories behind the icons of music, the people who have lived through the glory, the chaos, and even the silence of fame, follow Icons and Legacies. Here, we do not only talk about stars, we explore the stories behind the legends.